Hello students, welcome to Veranda IAS. From the current affairs of environment, in this session we are going to discuss about India's largest floating solar power project. The learning objective of this particular session will be to discuss floating solar power project, then describe the Simhadri thermal station, then explain the advantages of thermal station. Thermal station basically means thermal power station. So list the challenges of constructing thermal station, and then we will expand National Thermal Power Corporation of India, that is NTPC, known in common language. So with that, let's move on first to understand what do we mean by the floating solar power project. So before we move on to the understanding of floating solar power, one thing is important is that solar energy is the cleanest source of energy. Okay, we all know the solar energy is converted into the electrical energy using the principles of photoelectric effect, and we store that electricity, and that electricity is utilized for whatever purposes we have to utilize. But the problem or the only limitation of the solar energy is that it requires a surface. Okay, and surface means what? It requires a surface where you can actually install the solar panels, and that requires a larger space. But in today's world, when we are talking about the land and real estates and all those things, so land is very precious thing. So the input that you will be providing for getting that solar energy and the output you are getting, so that is somewhere or other there is some viability gap into that. So the point here is how to find those surfaces. Okay, like if there is a barren land, there can be other utilizations also, but if you are using the solar panels and installing over that land cannot be used for any other purposes. So that is the limitation, and with that limitations, so answer is what? We can find the floating solar power project. Now what is floating solar power project? So floating, by the name as it goes, it will be floating. So floating means it will be on the water surface. So that is the only viable liquid that is present on the planet and on the surface. So the floating solar power plants are being examined as an alternative to dealing with the land scarcity. We require clean sources of energy. Clean sources of energy is solar energy, but solar energy requires the land, and land is scarce. So we have to look into other options, and the floating solar power plants are one of the best examples. The idea is to install solar panels on floats that are placed on dams, lakes and other water bodies. So like we have a large water bodies, so how can we place those solar panels on those bodies? So actually we will not be requiring the land. So that is being examined, and that is even more successful in present times and more, what you can say, viable also. In area where land is expensive and scarce, floating solar makes natural sense. Floating solar is welcome relief for areas like Uttar Pradesh, which have a sizable market for additional renewable energy but little land to spare because of the population pressures and the land being very fertile. So wherever, like for in a region wherever the land is very fertile, why should one invest in having solar energy from that land? Otherwise, and if people go for that, again there will be food scarcity and things like that. So we have to find the viable options, and this is the best option. So floating solar panels, if you are placing them on the water bodies, then you will have a greater things. And then in markets like Uttar Pradesh, as given as an example, because in Uttar Pradesh population pressure is very high, land is very scarce, then we have to look into those points. So further, the Asian countries dominate the worldwide floating solar market, with China and Japan accounting for majority of the 259 megawatt of operational capacity. So yes, it is accepted. Here we started, it was being examined, and by the time here we reach, we are finding that yes, it is accepted, and it can function, it can work. So Asian countries are dominating that floating solar market, where China and Japan are leading in it, where they are producing majority of 259 megawatt of operational capacity. So now floating solar power project in news. So what was the news? The NTPC is National Thermal Power Corporation in Visakhapatnam, Andhra Pradesh, has completed the commissioning of world's largest floating solar photovoltaic project, measuring 25 megawatt on the reservoir of its Simhadri thermal power plant. Okay, so this is the news, and because of this news we are learning that this is the image out of it. So the point again, understand, in Visakhapatnam, NTPC, National Thermal Power Corporation, has commissioned a plant of largest floating solar power plant, or we can also say solar photovoltaic project, and it measures around 25 megawatt, and it is located on the Simhadri thermal power station plant. Okay, so remember this is a factual information which is very important from the prelims perspective. The project is world's largest floating solar photovoltaic project. India's largest floating solar photovoltaic project at its Simhadri thermal station in the Visakhapatnam. So that is the same point. So points to remember: NTPC, Visakhapatnam, then Simhadri thermal power plant, and that has the world's largest floating solar photovoltaic project. Remember? So that was the news, and that's why we are learning it. So let's move ahead and see the Simhadri thermal power station. Simhadri station, a 2000 megawatt coal-fired power plant, was the first to execute an open sea intake from the Bay of Bengal, which has been operational for more than 2 decades. So in a ways, we can say it is one of the significant thermal power stations of Andhra Pradesh. More than 1 lakh solar photovoltaic modules will be used to generate electricity enough to power nearly 7,000 homes. So that is again a very significant achievement. Further, obviously, because of photovoltaic effects, photovoltaic cells and solar energy, what can we expect is reduced CO2 emissions by approximately 46,000 tons. So that is another significant achievement. So reducing the CO2 emissions is the only core that we have to look into. Now, it also saves 1,364 million liters of water each year, which will help to cover the annual water needs of 6,700 homes. Now, why it is there, we will come to that, because see, there is requirement of cooling of water, but then because the solar panels are placed above the water surfaces, the water will not directly be absorbing the heat from the sun, and obviously their temperatures will be reduced. Now, what are the advantages of floating solar power projects? So, most significant advantages address land acquisition issues. So, land is the scarce resource, limited resource. Okay, so it is scarce. So, acquisition issues will always be there. So, that has to be addressed. But now, when you are using the floating solar power project, obviously land acquisition issues will be reduced, because if you are using the dams, rivers and all those things, obviously these water bodies are not the property of any individual, they are of the society, and we can say they are of the government. So obviously government will not have to address those issues. So land acquisition, grid connectivity, regulations and offtake are the main hurdles that renewable energy power plants confront. But then when you are using these things, you will not be requiring that. Then cooling effect, this is an important one which I told earlier slide also in brief. The cooling effect of the water bodies improves the effectiveness of solar photovoltaic panels by 5% to 10%. So the cooling effect, so now it is placed on water, so it will have the cooling effect on the panel. So that also reduces the efficiency, that also addresses the effectiveness of the solar panels. So that is again important one. Over the time, this translates into significant cost savings, because see, it is a semiconductor device. Semiconductors are there. Semiconductors operate at certain optimal temperatures. But if the temperatures are high or low, that will decide the efficiency of this. But if the cooling effect is there, then what can we expect? That their cost, the photovoltaic effectiveness will be increased by the 5 to 10%, and if you are doing that in long race, it will be significant, cost will be saved. Then there are other advantages, so like grid connections expenses were lowered, water evaporation was reduced, water quality was enhanced, and algal blooming was minimized. So these all because you are placing solar panels on the surface of the water body, and obviously when you are placing that, the pollution will be limited. So all these are the other advantages of the floating solar power project. Then further, what are the challenges in construction of the thermal station we will be seeing? Now, thermal stations, we have to see an alternative. Thermal stations are not a renewable source of energy, because they will require coal and all those things. And mining a coal, getting a coal, and the environmental damages that it causes, they are very significant. So, what are the challenges in construction of the thermal station? They are as follows. First is the increased cost. It is costly thing. Then there are safety issues involved in the construction of the thermal power plant. Obviously, it's a big plant. Then further, degradation and corrosion. So even the land degradation, because see, there will be an ash when the coal is burned. So the ash either may be fried, or it will have to be dumped. So that dumping of ash also causes a degradation and the corrosion of the area where it is located. Further, understanding of water wet topography. This is also very important over here. So with that, that was just a brief points about the challenges that are there. But there is one important organization that we have to look into, and we will look it into brief only in context of the UPSC, and that is NTPC, that is National Thermal Power Corporation. Now what is it? It is an Indian statutory organization. Statutory organization means which has a legal backing, which has been established by the law of parliament. So it is an Indian statutory organization that generates energy and engages in related business. So it is related to the energy sector. It was established under the Companies Act of 1956 and is governed by the Ministry of the Power. So obviously it is very simple to correlate also. So with the correlation also you can remember that. Further, the generation and the distribution of power to India's state electricity boards is the fundamental role of NTPC. So see again, state governments do not have their thermal power plants. So it is like the central government's NTPC, which is an organization which will look into the thermal power plants, and obviously with that they will be providing the energy and distribution, generation of energy and the distribution of energy will be done by them to the state government. So that is very important significance or role of the NTPC in India. It has 62,086 megawatt electric power production capacity, making it India's largest power corporation. In the sense, there are also private players in the power sectors, like for example Adani, Ambani, their groups are there, Tata groups are there, but overall NTPC is the largest power corporation in India. So to summarize what we have learned floating solar power project, then we studied the Simhadri thermal station. Further, we studied the advantages of the thermal station, and then the challenges of constructing a thermal station, and then we studied the National Thermal Power Corporation in brief. So with that, I hope you have understood whatever we have discussed in this particular session. That's it for this session. See you in another one. Thank you.